morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 4. We're talking about cells. Chapter 4 is all about cells. Cells are made of two basic things. The two basic things that cells are made out of is the cell membrane, sometimes called the plasma membrane, which is the wrapper, which is the outer boundary of the cell. You would probably call it the cell wall, but please don't. Cell wall is specifically found in plants and in fungi, not found in animals. Plants have a cell membrane and a cell wall. Fungi have a cell membrane and a cell wall. Animals only have a cell membrane. The cell membrane is the wrapper that goes around the outside of the cell. It is not a bad mental image to imagine that a cell is like a water balloon. Imagine a cell as a water balloon that is floating in a pool. So what's all inside of the cell? Water. What's all outside of the cell? Water. That's what a cell's life is like. It is filled with water. It is surrounded by water. And it is the cell membrane. It's the rubber of the balloon that is the boundary between the inside and the outside of the cell. And that is called the cell membrane. It's actually a phospholipid bilayer. We talked about phospholipids in Chapter 2. Remember the phospholipid was that weird-looking balloon with the two little squiggly tails coming underneath of it? That's what a phospholipid looks like. We'll look at it again in just a minute. It is a phospholipid bilayer. Two layers. Two layers of phospholipids. So the top layer, the phospholipids, the phosphate head, the polar part of the phospholipid, points out towards the water. The bottom layer, the phosphate heads, point inside towards the interior of the cell, which is all water. And then those lipid tails all point at each other, from the top down or from the bottom up, and they make it so that it's very difficult for anything to get through that cell membrane. Phospholipid bilayer, two layers of phospholipids. The cell membrane is not only just phospholipids. The cell membrane is also made of membrane proteins. So that phospholipid bilayer makes a very effective barrier. It actually makes it really difficult for anything that can mix with water. It makes it very difficult for it to get through the cell membrane. That nonpolar center of the cell membrane where the phospholipid, where the lipid tails are, polar things can't get through it. So if you imagine that you built a house. You built a brick house around yourself with no windows or doors. Would you be really safe inside of that brick house with no windows or doors? Could anybody get into you? Could anybody get in and give you the Rona? You'd be really safe inside of that brick house. But what's the problem? The problem is you'd run out of food, and you'd need to get food inside. The problem is you'd be making trash, and that trash would need to go outside. But you made a brick wall, you made a brick house with no windows or doors. So yeah, you're safe inside, but nothing can come in and nothing can go out. And that's what the cell membrane would be like for the cell if it didn't have these membrane proteins. Membrane proteins are essentially like doorways or windows to allow some things to come in but not everything, to control what can get into or get out of the cell. So these membrane proteins are embedded within that phospholipid bilayer, just like your doorway is embedded within the wall of your house. Some of these proteins, as we just said, are channels, they're tunnels, they're doorways that allow ions and other molecules to pass into or out of the cell. Some proteins are more than just passive doorways that allow things to come in. Some are actually pumps. A pump has to be powered. A pump has to have energy to make it work, and these pumps have to be energized. They've got to have something, an energy source to make them work. We'll talk about pumps when we get there. But now think about it. A pump is moving something against the way it wants to go, and we'll talk about specifically these special proteins that act as pumps within the cell membrane. So this picture right here, this is a cross-section of the cell membrane. Now what I want you to imagine, take that water balloon in your mind. Use your mental microscope and get super up close onto the balloon itself. You're going to take and you're going to cut that balloon. And you're going to look at the rubber on edge so you can see what it's actually made of. And when you do that, this is what you see. This is the skin of a cell cut in cross sections so we can see how it's constructed. Here's that bilayer that we talked about, the two layers. Here's the top layer of phospholipids. Here's the bottom layer of phospholipids. One of these little balloons with two little squiggly tails coming down, that's one phospholipid. There's two layers of them. There's the top layer and the bottom layer, bilayer of phospholipids. Anything that would be floating around outside the cell would have to be polar. We talked about this in chapter 2. If you're going to mix with water, you have to be polar. If you're going to be mixing around, if you're going to be swimming around outside here, and by swimming I mean like molecularly swimming, not an actual fish. But any kind of a molecule that would be out here in the water would have to be polar. And if it's polar, it can move around in the water, no big deal. And it could come down and it could try to wiggle its way between the heads. And it would be successful. It could get between the heads because this little molecule in the water is polar. The heads are polar. So I'm polar, you're polar, we're all cool. But then once they get down here into the center, in the center of the phospholipid bilayer, remember the tails are non-polar. Oil and water don't mix. Why don't they mix? They don't mix because water is polar and oil is non-polar. That's why they don't mix. So polar things and non-polar things can't mix. So I'm a little polar molecule that's trying to get inside of my cell. When it hits the polar heads, it's cool. It's no big deal. But then when it hits those non-polar tails in the center, it can't get through. And it gets pushed back out again. And the same situation would happen if something were coming up from underneath, from inside the cell. It'd be moving around inside the cell. The cell is full of what? The cell is full of water. Because the cell is full of water, a little polar molecule can move around in it. It tries to wiggle between the heads, and it can. It can wiggle between the heads, but then what happens when it hits these non-polar tails in the center? And the answer is it can't get through. So here is my brick wall that nothing can get through. Woohoo! The cell is safe. Nothing's going to eat up the cell from the inside. Nothing's going to infect it. Problem is, well, nothing can get out, and nothing can get in, like food. So things have to be able to come in. And so some of these proteins, these big molecules right here are proteins, membrane proteins. Some of them have actual channels that go through them that allow things to come through, just like a doorway. It's a channel. It allows you to go through into the house or out of the house. So these are membrane proteins. So the phospholipid bilayer is not only just phospholipids. It also has proteins woven into the very fabric of the phospholipid bilayer. There are two basic kind of cells on Earth. Those that have organelles and those that don't. The ones that don't have organelles are called prokaryotes. Pro means before. Kary literally means kernel, as in like a kernel of corn. But we take it to mean nucleus, because that was the first name for the nucleus. It was the kernel. So prokaryote means before the kernel, but kernel refers to the nucleus, so it literally means before the nucleus. So prokaryotes, oat just means a representative of this group. So prokaryote is a cell that doesn't have a nucleus. And we can expand that definition and say it's a cell that doesn't have organelles like we're used to thinking about. It does have one particular organelle that we'll talk about, but it doesn't have any of the others. It doesn't have, you learned in high school biology, it doesn't have a nucleus. It doesn't have mitochondria. It doesn't have chloroplasts. It doesn't have rough ER, smooth ER, Golgi. It doesn't have any of those things. They are anucleate. Anucleate. What does it mean? What does nucleate mean? Well, nucleate means nucleus. A nucleate, what does it mean when you put a or an in front of anything? It means without. So a nucleate means without a nucleus. The prokaryote organisms that we have are bacteria and these other things called archaea. They're similar to bacteria in that they are prokaryotes, but that's where the similarity ends. But they're another life form. Prokaryotes are enucleate. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have organelles. We just talked about that. Bacteria do have cell walls, and those cell walls are made out of peptidoglycan. We've broken this word apart before. Let's do it one more time. What does peptide mean? Well, the only word that I've ever heard of that has peptide in it is the peptide bond. And what is the peptide bond? Well, the peptide bond is how you link together amino acids. Right. What do you get when you link together a whole bunch of amino acids? I get a protein? Yes. So peptido probably refers to something related to proteins. What does glyc mean? What's the glycemic index? What is hypoglycemic? What is glycolysis? Glyc means sugar. So peptidoglycan means protein sugar. It is a molecule that has a piece of it that is like a protein, and it has another piece of it that is like a sugar, and they're stuck together. Better question. Which is it? Is it a sugar with a protein stuck to it? Or is it a protein with a sugar stuck to it? When we look at words like this, the last word is what the thing is. The first word is how it's modified. So what is this thing? This is a sugar that has a protein stuck to it, peptidoglycan. Peptidoglycan is a special molecule that is only found in bacteria and nowhere else. It's not found in these archaea things. It's not found in plants, animals, or fungi. It's only found in bacteria.